Hey everybody, it's Courtney, and today we're going to be creating a one-layer scene using the Trick or Treat stamp set by Simon Hurley Create. And today I'm actually going to be making a 5x7 card just because I want to be able to fit everything I want that I sort of have envisioned in my mind. So you can see that I have cut some masks and I'm just kind of laying them out the way I think I'm going to want them. And then I'm going to take a pencil just to mark out how much room I'm going to need. Now, what I plan on doing is I plan on drawing out a scene as if you are standing inside of a house with a door open and the trick-or-treaters on the outside of the door. So I want to make sure that I have my door opening big enough to fit my little trick-or-treaters. So I am going to start off with very light pencil lines and my T-square ruler to kind of draw in my scene. Now, it's going to be a little bit out of an angle. So I drew my floor at an angle and then the top portion of the opening of the door. Now for the door itself, being this is swung open and swung towards us, both the top and the bottom of the door are going to be at angles. So one angle is going to go down, one angle is going to go up. And honestly, I have never taken an art class except for in school. But I get a lot of questions on like how I know which direction things are supposed to go. And honestly, just stand in front of an open door. That's literally what I did. I knew what kind of scene I wanted to build, and I stood in front of an open door and kind of got an idea of what it would look like drawn on paper. So that's pretty much how I did it. I did add a few details to the door just so that it actually looks like a door. And then I also drew some very light pencil lines for the door frame itself. Now, I know it's very hard to see on camera, but in just a minute here, I will kind of show you what it looks like before we actually begin our stamping. I'm not making anything permanent at this point, so I can always change things as I go along if I need to. So again, I apologize for not really being able to see this too well, but you can see that I have the basic scene all drawn in, and then I can move on to the stamping. And this is going to be similar to all of the other scenes that I've created before. There's just not a whole lot of stamped images that I'm using. There's a whole lot of stamped images in the stamp set, but I'm only using a few here. And remember, when you're doing masking, you want to mask front to back. So whatever object is in front of another, you want to make sure that you're stamping and masking first. So I like to lay out my images with my masks first and then kind of just lay down whatever stamp is in front or whatever image is in front, and then I can close my MISTI door and stamp those images first. So in this case, it's going to be the little pumpkin bucket she's carrying and the little bag he's carrying. I am going to stamp these out with blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, and then I can mask these images out. Then I can move on to the next layer, if you want to call it, which is going to be the little girl. And she's going to be a little bit in front of the boy. You can put them side by side. I just didn't have quite enough room, so there's going to be a little overlap here. So I went ahead and stamped her out. Now I did stamp her twice. She is pretty big, and her mouth is open, which would be black, and I want that to stay black. So in order to get a really good bold black outline, I did stamp these particular images twice. So again, I went ahead and masked her out, and then I can move on to my little robot little boy here, and he's going to go directly next to her, and I'm just making sure that I'm lining up his little hand to make it look as if he is holding the handle of that little bag, the treat bag that he's holding on to. So once again, I stamped him out twice and then masked him out. By the way, I am using Simon's stamp masking paper because I do plan on doing some ink blending in the background, and I find that that's the best masking paper to use when doing ink blending. It usually doesn't budge. So once I have them all stamped out, I'm going to finish off with this little pumpkin and the little cat, which is going to be in the inside of the house. So I'm stamping the pumpkin and masking that first, and then I can stamp the little cat next to it. Now, I masked out the cat, but I didn't actually need to. My plan was to do ink blending for the entire background, but that didn't really work out, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Really, nothing worked out for this card the way I had in mind, but you kind of go with the flow and make it work. So I went ahead and masked out my little cat here, and then I can make all of my lines permanent and kind of adjust them if I need to, but I'm going to be using a Copic Safe pen. I'm using an EK Success journaling pen, which they no longer make, but I will link something below. It's a Letterit journaling pen. I think it's called a journaling pen, but either way, I will link it below. I find that it's very, very similar to the EK Success journaling pen. Even the packaging is very similar in the fact that when you get the multi-pack, you get different size tips. So depending on your stamped images, you know, some of them have really fine lines, some of them have thicker lines. You can find one that closely matches it. So I'll link that below. It's the closest thing that I can find, and it's a really good price point as well. So I'm going to go over all of those pencil lines. You can see that I have my masks in place, so I can kind of just go over the masks and not have to worry about working around my images. And then we are going to start our ink blending. So I want to make it as if it's nighttime, naturally. These guys are trick-or-treating. So I'm going to do some ink blending just on the outside. So the outside, but the inside of the door, if that makes sense. What would be the outside? So we're going to basically create a night scene here. So I need to mask off the outside of the door. So everything that is not the outside or the inside of the door, that's going to get confusing. But outdoors, I should say, outdoors. So I have to mask around the door. Again, I erase my pencil lines. Once you go over those with ink blending or Copic markers, alcohol markers, any other coloring medium, you're not going to be able to get rid of them. So I'm using some Post-it note tape, and I'm just lining that up right around my door, right using the lines that I've drawn in. And I'm only going to be using 2 colors here. I also used a piece of masking tape to kind of create a ground for them to be standing on, which I guess would be the porch or patio, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to use 2 colors here, Midnight Snack and Crown Me. And remember, these are dye inks. So when you are going in for a really bold color, which I love these inks because you can go with a really light hand and get a really like pastel look, or you can make it super dark. But when you're making it super dark, you want to start off fairly light. Because these are dye inks, they don't necessarily sit on top of the paper. They kind of soak right into the paper. So you want to start with a very light hand, kind of get a good layer of ink down, and then you can go in with a much heavier hand and really deepen that color up and get these colors to blend. So I use the blue on the bottom, and then I'll add the purple on the top, and you can see that I'm going over it many, many times to really darken these areas up. And then I'll go back to that really dark blue and darken that area up, and also make sure that it blends nicely with the purple. There's not a whole lot of it showing, so you don't need to use a ton of colors, but you can use as many as you want. You could probably get away with just using 1. So once that's done, I'm going to remove my Post-it note tape. Now, when I did this, I didn't let my ink dry. Let your ink dry a little bit. I didn't. And it tore the masks that I actually had on the images itself. So instead of cutting more masks, which I don't want to do, I can't really do ink blending in the background now for the wall and the floor. So I'm going to have to use my Copic markers for that, but that's okay. I'm using the tip of my scissors just to remove the remaining pieces of these masks because my ink is dry or wet. Again, let it dry. Don't do what I'm doing here because it can easily tear your paper. And you can see that right on the top of her head, it tore it a little bit. And that's simply because I didn't let my ink dry first. So give it like 5 minutes if you have more patience than I do. So next we are going to go on to the Copic coloring. And when I have a large scene like this, I prefer to do the background first. So I have this super sped up a lot more than I normally do just for time purposes. So I'm going to start off with the porch that they're standing on, and I'm going to be using some warm grays. I'm going right in with the darkest color first. I'm going to add some shadows underneath each one of my little characters here. And then the further back something gets, the darker it will appear. So I'm adding a little bit of shading towards the back of the porch as well, or the further back the porch seams. Then I'm going to blend that out with the W5, W3, and then finish off with the W1. And each time I'm just extending that shadow underneath this little girl and this little boy. Next, I'm going to move on to the floor. I'm going to use some E20s. And here's another issue that I had here. So I'm starting off with my lightest color just to get the paper saturated a little bit. I added a shadow underneath my cat and the pumpkin, and then I figured I'll add a shadow off to the left-hand side. Really, honestly, no rhyme or reason for it. I just needed it to be away from the rest of the shadow area. Then I can go in with the E29 and just kind of go over those darkest areas, extend that out with the E25, E23, and then, of course, my plan was to finish off with the E21 that I started with, to saturate the paper with, which would have been my lightest color. My marker is so dry, and this is a huge, huge area. Now, don't force it. If your marker is dry, either try to find a different color or obviously refill it. I don't have a refill for this marker, so that wasn't an option. So instead of ruining my nib, I am going to get the lightest layer that I can possibly get down. Obviously, I'm not going to get a good blend here, but I just took a look at my Copic chart and kind of picked a color that closely matches the E21, and I found that the E53 is very, very close to the E21. So I ended up finishing off with that, just making sure that these areas blend. I did end up having to go over it twice just because it wasn't an exact match, but overall it wasn't that bad. You can see I have a big smudge there from my purple ink that I had. I must have had it on my finger. So that's going to be where my sentiment is anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So here's issue number 3. I wanted to kind of keep it simple for the wall. I was going to use E99 and E95, and I never used my E95. I don't think I've ever used it, and for some reason, the nib was just no good. So I tried to use the chisel nib on it, and it worked good in the beginning. But then once I got to the top of the wall, you can see that it's really, really streaky. And I tried to go over it multiple times, and it just wasn't working. And I know there's ink in here. I know there's ink because I never have used this marker. So I don't know what the issue was. I guess the nibs were just bad because probably it sat for God only knows how long. So I ended up, again, pulling out my Copic chart and finding a color that was similar, that I know has a ton of ink, and I know that the nibs are good, and I just went over that area. You may have to go over it more than once in order to get rid of those streaky lines that you'll get with any alcohol marker, but I got much better coverage with this color. So next we're going to move on to the door frame and the door itself. I'm going to bring out some E50 markers, and I'm going to add a little bit of shading where the door frame is coming up from the floor, and also these square things that are on the door. I don't know what you call them, but I only added them so that it actually looks like a door. I'm going to add some shading on the inside of both of the black lines that I put in there. And that is just to add a little bit of dimension and kind of separate it from the rest of the door. I'm also adding a little bit of shading on where the door is actually open and connected to the door frame. Next, going to move on to the E57, and I'm just extending these areas out a little bit further. For the large areas, you can see that I am using a flicking motion, and that's just to get a good blend. And for these little squares or rectangles, whatever, I'm just basically outlining it and just extending it out a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing with the E55, again, just using some flicking motions for the larger areas. And then I can finish off with the E53, which will be my lightest color for this particular area. And when you go in with your lightest color, you just want to make sure that you're not touching the darkest area. So you're not touching the E59 with the E53 because you're going to drag that color out. And you can see that I did that just a little bit underneath that top square. I was able to kind of blend it out a little bit so it's not too noticeable, but it's very easy to do. Remember, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender. So next, going to move on to my little trick-or-treaters here. Going to color two different color skin tones here. For this first one, I am going to use the E04 as my darkest color, just basically adding some shading underneath their hair. And that's pretty much the only shading that I'm adding, except for the inside of their arms and legs. And of course, on either side of their necks, which I always seem to forget. Always. And you'll see that I forgot it with him. I had to go back afterwards. For him, the darkest color for him is going to be a E18, but you can see that I'm using a lot of the similar colors or same colors for both of them. I'm just going a little bit darker for him. I also added a little bit of shading underneath his nose because his nose is shaped differently than hers. His is swooped down, hers is swooped up. And here's where I forgot the neck, so I did have to go back for the neck. For her hair, I want to color her as a blonde, and I initially started off with an E99 as my darkest and realized that wasn't going to quite be dark enough. So I started with the E37 as my darkest, and then I can blend that out starting with that E99. I added shading to where her hair is parted and also her little pigtails where her hair would be gathered to create those pigtails. That would naturally be a little bit darker. For his hair, I'm going to start off with my black marker, and I do have a C7, but again, that's another dried up marker that I have. So I would normally go with the C7 next, but I can't. So I'm going in with the C5. Is it a perfect blend? No, but it's hair, so it's going to have a lot of natural highlights anyway. So for his little robot body here, I'm going to use some cool grays for this as well. Again, I would have used a C7 as my darkest, but can't. So the C5 will be the darkest for him. Not really too concerned with too much shading for this because he's got a whole lot of buttons and levers and everything else on his body that's going to have a bunch of color to it. So it's going to kind of hide the fact that I didn't get a perfect blend or a whole lot of contrast. So next I'm going to color her little dress here. And actually first I am going to, I'm going to color dress. So I'm going to use my RV 20 markers, which is probably my favorite combination out of all of the RVs. I know that RVs can be tricky. They tend to move rather than blend, if that makes any sense. And those of you who use RV markers will know exactly what I mean by that. But I don't seem to get that with the RV 20s. And I just love the color. So I tend to use that color combination a lot. Now I'm also going to bring in a V combination here for parts of her wings. I'm not sure. I think she's supposed to be a fairy because she's got her little wand there. But she could be a butterfly. She could be a ballerina. She could be anything you want her to be. But I'm just adding some shading on the inside of the wings. And you'll see that I'll go back to this RV combination that I used for her dress. And I'm going to color the rest of her little wings here with that same combination. And I'm just going to keep my shading consistent. So where I put the darkest V marker is also where I'm going to put the darkest RV marker. I hope that makes sense. As long as you keep your shading consistent, it will look right. It really doesn't matter where you put your shading. Don't be overly concerned with the light source. In this case, I don't have a light source. So I'm just putting shading where I think it should go. And as long as I keep it consistent, it will look just fine. Now for his little buttons and levers and gauges and all of this, I'm just picking some random colors. Just random colors from my Copic collection here so that I have a whole lot of color on his little robot body here. So next we're going to move on to the cat, and I'm going to bring back out my warm grays, same warm grays that I actually used for this little sidewalk. I'm adding some shading underneath his little chin and where one leg is behind or in front of another. Also some shading underneath his little unicorn. I guess it would be a hat. I guess you'd have to put, it would have to be some sort of hat that you'd put on a cat. My cat actually has a Halloween costume. He's had it ever since I got him. It's a little cowboy, and he does have a little cowboy hat. And every year I put it on him and take a picture, and he loves it. He's so photogenic. You guys probably already know Frankie, and you know how much he loves the camera. So I added a little bit of shading to that unicorn horn. Is it a horn? Well, that's what we're calling it. I added just a little bit of shading between each section. Now for the pumpkin, I'm going to add some shading to the top and the bottom and also in between each one of these little sections. And I'm going to keep this color combination out because I'm going to color the pumpkin that she's holding as well as the bag. Now I'm going to color her pumpkin a little bit different than what's supposed to be the real pumpkin because it is just a plastic pumpkin. So I'm adding shading to the same areas, but I'm not going to add shading in between each one of the sections. The yellow kind of didn't blend too well because I didn't really use some flick lines like I normally do. So I did go back with the YR04 to add those flick lines back in and get those to blend a little bit easier. So next I am going to, now that all of my coloring is complete, I did take a white gel pen just to add the whites back in their eyes because I colored directly over them, and also one of his teeth colored directly over that too. So I had to make that white again. And I'm also going to use a glitter gel pen. I think this is called Stardust, but I'll link it below. And I just added that to the unicorn horn because that's what I'm calling it. And that is it for the coloring. Next, we are going to move on to the sentiments. So there's two sentiments. Well, there's one sentiment that I absolutely had to use. Oh, first I added that little pumpkin face, jack-o'-lantern face, to the pumpkin bucket she's carrying. But the two sentiments, the one sentiment that I absolutely had to use is a little speech bubble. So I obviously wanted to put those directly above my little trick-or-treaters. And then I also have that smudge on the floor that I need to cover up. So I'm going to line up the Happy Halloween sentiment directly over that so you'll never know that little smudge is there. And I'm going to be stamping these with VersaFine Onyx Black ink because it is super crisp. And I need it to be super crisp because I only really have one shot at this. And the speech bubble is solid naturally. And I want it to be solid. But I didn't like the way it looked on top of the coloring. There was too many things behind it. So I ended up stamping this onto a piece of white cardstock, and this is just from my stash. And I let this dry for a couple of minutes because it is a pigment ink. Even though it's a fast drying pigment ink, it doesn't dry immediately. And then I fussy cut that. I also took my black Copic marker. You can take any black marker just to go over the edges to make sure that everything, you don't see that white outline from the paper and it actually looks like a black speech bubble. So next I'm going to go ahead and cut down my panel. And I just figured there was too much space in the wall. There was too much wall space and I didn't like that. So I cut it down just a little bit, not even a quarter of an inch smaller than my 5x7 card. And for my card base, I took one from my stash that I thought was a 5x7 card, but it clearly is not. I don't know what size this is, but I'm using my bone folder to make sure I get a nice good crease, and then I can adhere my card panel down just by leaving a small white border on all four sides and a huge one on the bottom because this is definitely not a 5x7 card. So I did have to trim that area off just a little bit. So I'm going to finish off by adding my little speech bubble. I didn't want to pop this up because it's got that little curvy part on the bottom, and I was afraid that that would get stuck in an envelope once I mail this out. So I just glued that flat down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue right on top of the stamped image that I had to begin with. And that's it. That is the card for today. I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.